10 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor. There were a group of citizens in the little town of North Platte, Nebraska. How many of you know where North Platte, Nebraska? See, it's a little town you've never heard. The citizens of North Platte, Nebraska heard a rumor that some of the soldiers from Nebraska were going to be traveling through the train station that went right through their town as they were being transported to the West Coast. And some of those soldiers came from North Platte. So 500 citizens gathered that day to meet the train. And there were moms that had cookies and cakes for their sons who were going to be on that train. And they had brought books and magazines and gifts for these boys. And they were there to meet the train. And the train came in, and the soldiers were on the train. But they weren't from the Nebraska National Guard Company D, as they thought. They were from the Kansas National Guard Company D. And there was this awkward silence for a moment because they didn't know what to do. These weren't the soldiers they were planning on giving the gifts to. And then one of the moms just kind of broke through the crowd, and she took all the gifts that she had prepared for her own son. They were going to be birthday presents for him. And she gave them to a total stranger, one of these soldiers who was on the train. And the other 500 people just followed her lead, and they all just went over and they just blessed all of these boys on the train with gifts and just hugged them and loved them and sent them off on their way. And it was this incredible, spontaneous moment of generosity and kindness. And it so touched the people in the town. But one of the ladies, a 26-year-old lady named Mae Wilson, she wrote a letter to the editor in the town paper, and she talked about what an incredible event it was for the town to come out and just give this spontaneous blessing to these total strangers as they went off to war. And then she suggested that maybe the town could open a canteen right there at the station so that they would have food and gifts there for the other soldiers that were going to be coming through every single day. And she even volunteered to head up the effort. And so they opened the North Platte Canteen, and they began to bless these soldiers. I have some pictures of some of the things they did. Now, what's amazing is what happened. In the next 4.5 years, the people from North Platte and the surrounding communities would greet every troop train that came through. There were some days when 8,000 men would come through on one day. And they would have cakes and birthday cakes and all kinds of things for these soldiers as they came through. And by the end of the war, when the last train came by on April 1st of 1946, the people from North Platte had blessed 6 million soldiers. 6 million soldiers. Can you imagine a tiny little town like that to help that many men as they went off to war? There was a man who wrote a book about this, otherwise we wouldn't know the story. Bob Greene wrote a book called Once Upon a Town. It's the story of the North Platte Canteen. And he interviewed a lot of the soldiers who had been there firsthand and experienced this. Of course, he interviewed them 50 years later, and by the time he interviewed them, they were in their late 70s and their 80s. And he said that these soldiers had one universal reaction whenever he would ask them about the North Platte Canteen. He said they all cried. 50 years later, they just cried because they were so touched by the love and the generosity of these people. Now, how does a small town do such a huge task as North Platte did? And the answer is teamwork. One person couldn't have done it. Mae Wilson couldn't have done it herself. But 45,000 people working together did that. We're talking about change and how change happens and how throughout history, most of the great changes that took place and most of the great tasks that were performed by teams of people that worked together. Nehemiah has been our example of change, and he realized that he could not build the walls by himself. He was going to need a lot of people to work with him on building these walls. Now, just to give you some background, if you weren't here last week, Jerusalem had been attacked and ransacked and destroyed in about 465 BC. And the temple had been destroyed, the walls had been knocked down, and the gates had all been burned. And without walls and without gates, They were vulnerable to attack, and it was like they were in disgrace in this situation. And Nehemiah felt moved. In fact, God called him to be the person who would come back and rebuild these walls. Even though at the time Nehemiah was 800 miles away in Babylon. Remember, the Babylonians had been the ones who attacked Jerusalem and leveled it. And they had carried Nehemiah and many others off into slavery. And now Nehemiah was working as a cupbearer to the king. And God brought word to him about Jerusalem, and his heart was broken, and he felt compelled to do something. We ended last week's scripture by reading the last verse in Nehemiah chapter 1. And I want you to see Nehemiah's reaction here. He says in Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 11, he prays this prayer, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayers of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was a cupbearer to the king. So Nehemiah began with prayer. As he felt compelled to go make a change, he knew that he and himself didn't have the ability to do it, and he called upon God to give him success. That's always the great starting point, is to humbly recognize our limitations and to realize that nothing's impossible for God, no matter how big the task is. So he began that way. He began by praying for success, and then he would ask the king if the king would let him go. In Nehemiah chapter 2, he puts all of this into practice. And we read in the beginning of Nehemiah chapter 2, in the month of Nisan, I don't know if you know where that is. It's like right after the month of Toyota, I think it is. But literally, it's 4 months after chapter 1, by the way. So Nehemiah prayed that God would give him success. And he has 4 months to pray about it and think about it before he actually makes the request to the king in the month of Nisan, of all things. It was in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought to him. Remember, he's the cupbearer. I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now, for 4 months, he's been planning this, and I want you to see how prepared he is as he gets into this. But look what happens with the king. He says, Nehemiah says, I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid. Why was Nehemiah afraid? Well, in that culture, if you were to come into the presence of the king, you had to be at your best. You didn't come into the presence of the king and be moaning and groaning and crying and wailing about other things. You had to be at your best. So as the cupbearer to the king, he had been coming into the king's presence every day for years, and the king had never seen him sad before, because it was actually dangerous to come into the king's presence and be sad. The king didn't need that. So anybody who came into his presence would put on a happy face. And this day, he, for the first time, and all the time he's known Nehemiah, he sees this sadness in his face. He knows that, he says, it must be sadness of his heart. But Nehemiah was also afraid because this was the moment he'd waited for 4 months. He prayed that God would give him success. But he waited 4 months before he asked the king for permission to leave. As I said before, the king has no reason to let him go. He's found a cupbearer that he trusts, and that's not easy to find. That means that nobody can poison his drink because the cupbearer is his trusted man. And now this guy is going to be asked to go back to Jerusalem. Why would the king let him go? There's no reason why he would. In fact, the king could be so angry about it that he could cut his head off for asking such a question. And so he was afraid. But it didn't stop him, because in verse 3 he says, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. By the way, that's a great thing to ask, to say when you're about to ask for somebody, something. Kids asking their parents if they can stay out. May mom live forever. Can I stay out till midnight tonight? It's a good thing to try that, see if it works. He says, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Nehemiah feels passion about this. He he feels disgraced because the city's been disgraced. And even more, he doesn't want God to be disgraced because he knows that that city of Jerusalem is where God is present. And he feels like if the walls are destroyed and the gates are destroyed, the temple's destroyed, that God will be disgraced. And he is passionate about this cause, and he spells it out for the king. The king said to me, in verse 4, "What is it you want?" Now notice, Nehemiah pauses once again and says, "Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and then I answered." I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah, where my ancestors are buried, so I can rebuild it." Then the king, with his queen sitting next to him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" Now, just a little note here. Our records show that Nehemiah never answered the question. I don't know if this was part of the strategy, if he just changed the subject. Maybe there was conversation when he did answer the question, but there's no record of it. The king thinks maybe this is a temporary thing. Go rebuild the walls, come back next month, and that sort of thing. But he says, after the king asks the question, Nehemiah simply says, "It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time." I also said to him, now isn't this something? Wouldn't you think at that point, he's asked the question, and the king says, "I'll send you." Wouldn't you think at that point it would be time to make your exit and get out of there while you still have your head on your shoulders? And he says, I also asked him, because he had thought this out very carefully in the past 4 months, what will I need to make this journey safely? Verse 7, I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy." And because of the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. Nehemiah went over and above. He had to ask the king's permission to leave, but he went over and above, and he wanted letters of safe passage, and he wanted the king to line up supplies for him to rebuild the gates, and he asked all of these extra things, and the king granted him success. But Nehemiah didn't say, "I was so persuasive that the king gave in." He said it was because God was so powerful. He answered his prayer, and he's praising God for the answered prayer that he was given success. Verse 9, "So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, and I gave him the king's letters." But look at this. This is a little lucky strike extra the king threw in here. The king had also has sent army officers and cavalry with me. He didn't ask for that, did he? Did I miss that when he was... The king said, if you're going to be traveling, that's going to be dangerous territory, so I'm going to send army officers and cavalry with you on your journey. Pretty nice of the king, wasn't it? It shows you a little bit of the relationship that he had with the king. Now he's going to run into some opposition. So look at verse 10. When Sanballat, the Honorite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite official, heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Now, these two were enemies of Israel, and they're going to be joined in a few minutes by a third enemy. And these are people who lived around Israel who did not want Israel to succeed. They wanted to destroy Israel. And one of the things that you have to recognize is that has not changed, has it? Little tiny Israel has been surrounded by enemies that want to destroy that nation to this day. And that's how it was then. So that when the Babylonians came and destroyed the walls, destroyed the temple, burned the gates, their enemies were thrilled, because that meant that Israel could never rebuild, would never be a power again. And so they're disturbed to find out that somebody's coming back to rebuild the walls. We'll see these guys again later. Verse 11, Nehemiah says, "I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on." Nehemiah was pretty good at keeping his mouth shut. He didn't come in and say, oh, guess what? We're going to rebuild the walls. We're going to do this. He just came in and kind of checked out the territory, and he kept it all to himself. But I love the way he said, I didn't tell him what my God had put on my heart to do. He didn't say, oh, I've got a great idea. No, God put it on his heart to do it. But he's keeping it to himself. And he goes out secretly now in verse 13. By night, I went out through the valley gate toward the jackal wall and the dung gate, which I think we'd avoid at all costs there, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. And then I moved toward the fountain gate and the king's pool. There was not enough room for my mount to get through. I think this is because of all the rubble from everything being destroyed. So I went up to the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priest or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in? Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. What Nehemiah is doing right there is called casting a vision. God gave him a vision to go back and rebuild the walls, but he can't do it by himself. And a leader has got to cast the vision to others to say, come, let's rebuild these walls so we'll no longer be in disgrace. And he has to sell that vision to these people. But he didn't say, do this because I'm a great leader and I can get it done. No, he says, God has put this on my heart. God has blessed me to this point. God is with us in this. If you join in with me, God is going to give us success. He cast that vision to the people because he couldn't do it by himself. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. Now here's the enemies again in verse 19. So when Sanballat the Honorite and Tobiah the Ammonite official, and here's the third one, Geshem the Arab, heard about this, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you are doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? They did two things right there. They mocked him and they threatened him. Oh, if you're rebelling against the king, whatever king they're talking about, we're going to report you. And there's opposition to this. There's going to be more opposition throughout the book of Nehemiah. This is not going to be an easy project. And when God calls you to do something great, don't expect that it's going to be easy. Some people think, oh, if God's behind it, everything is going to go smoothly. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes there's great opposition and great barriers to getting the job done. But Nehemiah didn't let the opposition or the mocking or the threatening or any of these barriers stop him. He continued because he believed that God was behind it and God could push through any barriers. And look how bold he is in the way he answered them in verse 30 or 20. I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or any historic right to it. But Nehemiah is not backing down, not an inch to these guys. His confidence, though, once again, his confidence is in God. The God of heaven will give us success. You cannot stop him. He's going to give us success. But do you notice what he says to these people? This is still an issue today. You have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. I hear that same language in the news today, where one group is saying to the other group, you don't have any claim to Jerusalem. You don't have any historic right to them, but they all claim that they do, and they fight over it to this very day for the same reasons he said. I have some pictures of the wall and what Jerusalem looked like. It's very different than it looks like today. This was Jerusalem in the time of Nehemiah. You see the shape of it. If you've been to Jerusalem or have seen maps of it, you know it's very different today. It looks much more rectangular than that. But in those days, that's what the wall looked like. So just to give you an idea of the size of the project, the wall that he is building around Jerusalem is 20 feet high. We're not talking about some little wall around your yard, some little gate separating you from the neighbors. 20 feet high. It's probably going to be about 10 feet wide. And it's going to go for 1.5 miles around all of Jerusalem. That's why he needs help. They've got to move a tremendous amount of stone. They're going to need engineers. They're going to need people to finance this. They're going to need many, many, many workers just to do the physical labor. We have another picture of some of the ruins that have been found of Nehemiah's walls. These are actually walls that they stacked, Nehemiah and his friends, that are now ruins, but you see how wide that is. You see how many stones. That's just one small section. Imagine that going 20 feet high for a mile and a half. Try to figure out how many stones are involved in that. They finished this project in 52 days. 52 days. Because God was with them and because there was a team of people involved. I'm not going to read all of Nehemiah 3, but if we can go to Nehemiah 3, just the first few verses, you'll get an idea of the teamwork involved in building this project. He starts off by saying, Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. I love the fact, by the way, that the priest and the high priest were the first ones to get involved in the project. They were leaders in this. They were religious leaders, and they were not used to doing physical manual labor. But they got out, and they led the way and were kind of role models for the rest of the people. They went out, and they rebuilt the sheep gates. It says they dedicated it and set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated as far as the Tower of Hananel. Now, in the next few verses, it's going to talk about all the men and their families who join in. It's like we see in verse 2. The men of Jericho built the adjoining section, and Zachar, son of Imri, built next to them. The fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hasaniah. They laid the beams and put its doors and bolts in place. And then the next 29 verses are going to be a list full of names. And it's going to be people like silversmiths and goldsmiths and other people who are not wall builders, but they go out there with their family. Sometimes it'll say this man was out there with his daughters, and they built this section of the wall, and this man was out there with his sons, and he built the next section, and this guy built the gate, and it lists all of these people they're involved in the project. It's a tremendous amount of teamwork. People of all ages and all backgrounds joined together with Nehemiah to accomplish a great, great task. Well, if you haven't heard of North Platte, Nebraska, you probably have not heard of Moorhead, Minnesota. How many have heard of Moorhead, Minnesota? Okay, one. That's good. Moorhead, Minnesota is the home of Concordia College. And the big event in Moorhead, Minnesota every year is when Concordia College puts on its Christmas concert. It's a great concert. They have hundreds of singers. They've got a live orchestra, and they put on this tremendous Christmas concert, and people come from all over to hear it. But the whole town gets involved in it. 6 months before the concert, people from the town, hundreds of people from the town, they gather together and they paint this, what will become the background for the concert. They're given like a huge mosaic, and it's almost like paint by numbers. This is what it looks like in the end. They paint one little section of that, and they have people anywhere from middle school up to seniors. And they'll come and they'll paint one little section, one color, or more than that. And by all working together, when the concert comes, this mosaic comes up and it looks like a huge, beautiful stained glass window. And the people sit there and they watch the concert, but they're in awe of this incredible artwork. This thing is 30 feet tall and 100 feet long. And it takes them 6 months. The whole town has to do it, because one person couldn't do it. And what happens when the concert comes, early in the morning, you can see these people coming, and they bring their families with them. And they go up to them and they say, you see that little green dot underneath the angel's foot? I painted that. And you hear everybody saying, you see that little red spot? Right? I painted that. And they do it with great pride, because what they accomplish is incredible. It's beautiful. But it's only accomplished with a great team. So I believe that after Nehemiah completed the task, 52 days later, when that wall was 20 feet tall and a mile and a half wide, the gates had been rebuilt, and Jerusalem was solid once again, no longer in disgrace. I think that you could hear on any given day people walking along the wall and saying to their friend, see that stone right over there? I put that in place. And they say it with pride. So I ask you, would you join with me on this task of doing something, building something that will outlive all of us building something for God that will outlive all of us. We can do it, but we can only do it together as a team. Let's make that change. Let's pray together.